Welcome back everyone to the React in-depth series. In this video, what we're going to do is go over a bunch of exercises together to get more practice with the ideas of prop drilling, props, as well as component composition that we looked at in the previous videos together. These exercises were a bit tricky to make. They're a bit wordy, so I apologize for that. What you can do is you can find them in the GitHub link down in the description, or you can just kind of follow along in the video and pause along as we kind of go through it together. These ones are a bit more hand-holdy than some of the normal exercises that we do, but I kind of assure you that if you can go through these and kind of really wrap your mind around what's going on with these exercises and how all the kind of data is flowing around these different components, that will really go quite a long way. And it's really good hands-on practice just to go kind of a bit beyond what we did in the previous kind of theoretical and explanation videos together. So let's just get right to exercises and see what I mean. Okay, so to start, I have a warm-up exercise, and then I have three kind of like normal exercises. And then I also have a bonus in here because I couldn't resist, and there's some fun ones in there that we can do together. And again, you can find these on GitHub, or you can just follow along on the video. So for the warm-up exercise, what I want you to do is create a new React project. Then I want you to create a paragraph.jsx file that has a component in it that returns just a regular p tag with some text in it, and you can like hard code that text in there. Then I want you to create a header.jsx file that has a component in it that returns an h1 tag with some text in it that's hard coded as well. So kind of these two elements, paragraph and header, that have some text. And then I want you to create a section.jsx file that composes one of these header files that you create and one of the paragraph components that you create, like one below the other. So you'll have a section that basically has these two components inside of it composed. Then you can replace the app in the main.jsx file that comes by default with the React project template and replace it with the section component right here that you make. And you want to make sure that you test this in your browser to make sure that it actually works. All right, so let's get right to actually building this one out together. So I'm just going to pull up my terminal. I'm just going to run npm create. I'll do vite at latest, and that's going to run their script there to start up this project. I'm actually just going to use one Vite project for all of these different exercises. You can create a separate one for all of them. It does take up quite a bit of space, so I would recommend you kind of just follow what I do. Just create one and just name different files inside of it so that you don't kind of have this mess of too many different React projects all in one folder. It's simple enough to just have one React project, even though I mentioned to create a new Vite project in each of these. These are just meant to be self-contained in case you do want to skip around. Okay, so I'm just going to call this props. I'll just call it props drilling, for example. It doesn't really matter. I'll say React there, and then I'll say JavaScript. It's going to be some instructions there. I want to cd into props drilling. I want to run npm install. And while that's installing, I'm going to go ahead and open up the folder that was created. I'm going to open up the src folder, which is the source. And then the ones that we're really interested in are the app.jsx and the main.jsx files. So I'm going to open that up. This is the main.jsx file right there. You can see that it imports app and then the app.jsx files right here. And it has a whole bunch of stuff in there. I'm just going to clean this up a little bit as I like to do. We're going to actually use these in the upcoming videos very shortly. But for now, I like to just kind of remove those. And I'm going to get rid of everything in here. And I'll just, for example, just put an H1 in here. That's definitely not an H1. That's a very big H1. And then I'll just say app, for example, just so that we have something working. And I'm going to remove every single import up here, including the actual CSS file. As well, I'm going to go over to the main.jsx and remove the CSS file there as well, just so that we have kind of the vanilla, nothing fancy going on with our styling, so we can really focus on the actual elements and the content that we're putting on the page. So once that's done, I should be able to run npm run dev, and that's going to run the dev script in the package.json file. It's going to give me a link to actually open this up in my local network right here. It'll probably change depending on what other things you have running on your system at the time, but generally you'll see a link like this. You can control or command click on it, and it should open up in your browser, and we can see our app file right there. I'm going to open up my terminal, my DevTools, I should say, and make sure everything looks good in there. There we go. There's my app. And I'll just zoom in on this page here just so that we can really make sure that we can see what's going on. Perfect. So that's all set up. Now, let's actually get to the actual exercise. So if you recall, we want to kind of create a paragraph component that has a p tag in there, a header component that has an h1 in there. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to actually create a new folder inside of my source. I'm just going to call this Warmup. And inside Warmup, I'm going to create a new file. I'll call this paragraph.jsx. And in here, I'm going to create a function. This is called paragraph. And we're going to return a p tag. And we're just going to have some text inside of here. I'll just call this warmup exercise. It doesn't really matter what you put in here, as long as you're returning it as a regular p tag, that should be fine. And then we can export default, or you can do a named export if you prefer that for our paragraph function right there. And I'll do the same thing for header. So I'll do a new file in my warmup folder here. And again, this folder structure, it's up to you if you want to kind of follow this style of structure or not. You can kind of do however you like. This is just simpler for me for this video and just a demo to all of you and just for some organization. In here, I'm just going to call this header.jsx. And I'll do a function. I should be able to zoom in more. I'll kind of get rid of this over here. And hopefully that's a little bit more clear. Function header. And inside of here, I'm going to return an h1. And I'll just say this is warmup header. And I'll export default my header component. Perfect. Then what we wanted, if we kind of go back to our exercise, is we wanted a section.jsx file that composes both of these together. Okay, so what that means is basically we need to import paragraph and we need to import header into a new file called section. And in that file, we can just render out our header and our paragraph below each other. So I'm going to create a new file here. I'll call this section.jsx, again in the same folder. I'll say function section. And if this feels tedious to you, that's a good thing, right? Like if you're doing this, you're like, oh my gosh, Nader, like how many times do I have to create these components and export them and return JSX? And like we're doing this over and over and over again. Partially, honestly, that's by design so that you can get your kind of mental model ready for this and muscle memory kind of building in your fingers, kind of just doing the same thing over and over again repetitively. To some degree, these are being changed slightly as we go, but it's a very good technique kind of to actually practice this a bit repetitively so that you actually know the underlying structure of these things without really thinking too hard about kind of like, oh, like, is it function or is it which export do I use or what am I returning? The more that you do it, the easier this stuff gets. So in here, let me just do an export really quick. Just down here, I'll say export default section. And now I said I want to compose my header and my paragraph. So I need to import them in order to use them. So I'll say import, I'll say header from /header.jsx. And then I'll say import paragraph from paragraph.jsx. And then what I can do is I can return, and in here I need to make sure that I return either a fragment or a div surrounding these, because I can't return a header and paragraph side by side because we can only return one parent or root element. So in this case, we're wrapping them in root elements, which in this case is a fragment, or you can use a div if you like. And I'm just going to put my header in here. And then right below that, I'll put my paragraph just like that. Okay, so we're just practicing composition here just to really get a sense of the structure of these things and make sure that we have a good warm-up going and our muscle memory and fingers are ready to do the harder exercises. And now that this is ready, what we should be able to do is we should be able to replace the app in our main.jsx file with this section component. And it should be able to show us both our, if we go back here, both our header and our paragraph on the page, right? So we need to go to our main.jsx file, and I'm going to say import section. And you want to be careful here. Make sure you're importing it from the correct folder. So I'm importing it from the current folder's warmup, and then warmup folder, and then section.jsx is in there, right? So current folder, warmup, and then section.jsx. And I'm just going to replace the app here with section just like that. Okay. Now, what should happen is if I switch back to my browser, I expect to see both the header and the paragraph render. So let's see if that worked. And there we go. All right. So that's pretty cool. So if I open this up here at my root div, I have my H1 right there, and then I have my P tag. And this is coming from a composition. And notice since I used a fragment, there's no kind of wrapper around these elements. It just kind of gets squashed down to them being siblings. And if I was to actually come back into the section and replace this, for example, with a div instead of a fragment, and I saved that, and I came back here, what we'll see is that now they're wrapped up in a div instead of a fragment. But since we're not using the div in this case, I would suggest just using a fragment where possible like this, so that you have very clean markup and you're not always having like this kind of like divception going on in your HTML. So it's very easy to see stuff unless you explicitly need that div for something like styling or sectioning of some kind. Okay. Wonderful. So that is the warm-up exercise. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's take a look at exercise 1. All right. Now, this doesn't really fit on the screen, so I'll kind of do my best to kind of go through this, and so you can actually pause the video and take a look. But again, you don't have to create a new Vite project, but if you're doing this as a brand new exercise, you skip the first one, then you want to create a Vite project, or you can reuse an existing one. And really, these are the instructions here, 2 to 5, and 6 is just checking it out. So again, we want to create a paragraph.jsx. I'm trying to keep this consistent across most exercises, so we don't have to mentally switch too much, and we can kind of focus on the actual concepts. So again, create a paragraph.jsx file that has a component that returns a p tag in it with some text. However, now the difference is, unlike the previous warm-up exercise where we hard-coded the text inside the p tag, what I want you to do is actually make this text that is going to go inside the p tag come from a prop that is passed into the paragraph component when it's actually being used in a parent component. Okay. Now, if this is confusing to you, definitely take a look at the prop video that came before this, and we go over props in detail over there. But if you've seen props before, hopefully you can make that work. And then same thing with the header.jsx file. I'm going to create a header file, returns an H1 with some text in it. Again, this time, instead of like the warm-up, we don't want to hard code the text this time. We want to make sure that the text comes from a prop that's passed into the component as an input to that function. And then to kind of wrap this up together, we want to put it in a section.jsx file that composes one header component with the paragraph component below it. But now we need to actually pass in those props in that JSX markup so that it can actually be used inside of those components respectively. Then again, you can replace the app in the main.jsx file with the section that you create over here for this exercise and make sure it works in your browser. And what you should see is your H1 and P show up with the correct text that you passed in as props. All right, so give that a shot and then we'll go through it together. All right, so I'll create a new folder here and I'll just call this exercise 1 for example. Let's go with that, nice and short. And I'll create a new file here. I'll call this paragraph.jsx. And another file, call this header.jsx, and a new file here, and I'll call this section.jsx. Okay, so since a lot of this is repeat, and I don't want to make this video too long, I'll actually copy and paste some of this code over here, and we'll see how it changes, just so that we can actually focus on the main changes here. So for paragraph, I'm going to switch over to Warmup, copy that code, save it over here. And we'll focus on this for now. So this is, again, a function paragraph. It's going to return our paragraph tag, and we're going to export it. But this is the key part that we want to change. We want to make sure that this is not hard-coded. All right, so how do we do that? Well, we know that we can get an input to our function. I'm going to call that props just to go with the convention here. And let's just say that we're gonna name the prop that gets passed in as text. Okay, so we're gonna assume that props.text gets passed in, and we'll see what I mean by that in a second. So what that's gonna allow us to do is I can replace this, and I'll put some evaluated JavaScript here, and I'm gonna grab from props, which is an object. which wraps up all of the different attributes or properties that are passed into this JSX tag from the parent. And I'm going to grab the text property that gets passed in, which we'll see shortly. We haven't done this part yet. So I'm going to call it text and keep this in mind when we go to the section component, so you can see exactly how that pans out over here. All right, and make sure we have this in curly brackets. Otherwise, this is literally going to show the text props.text, which is not what we want. We want to show the evaluation of the JavaScript props grabbing the text property and putting that in between these brackets. So we're going to do the same for header here. I'm going to grab this from the warm-up exercise. I'm going to paste it in header. So we can see here, same thing. This is going to, by default, render some warm-up header. We want to change that to be a bit dynamic. So I'm going to make this take props. I'm going to replace this stuff here with, and same thing, I'm going to assume props.text is passed in. And I'm going to do props.text here. Okay, and this is going to wrap it in an h1 tag. All right. Now for a section, I'm just going to copy all of this, and luckily it's all going to work because we're using relative imports. So what we're doing is in our section, I'm going to import header from this header, paragraph from this paragraph here, right? So be careful, you're importing it from relative imports. So if you didn't use relative imports and you use absolute imports, make sure you're actually changing these and when you're copying and pasting, if you're doing that, but everything else remains the same, right? So we're rendering our section element or component. We have our fragment, we have our header, we have our paragraph. This is what we did last time, and it rendered the kind of default text that we saw before. But what we want to do now is make it so we can actually change this dynamically. So I'll show you what I mean. If we don't pass anything in by default here, and I go to my main.jsx file, I want to import section instead of from warmup section.jsx. I'm going to change this to ex1 section.jsx. Actually, I'll just kind of like duplicate this and comment this one out just so that we can see kind of the progression of this ex1 section.jsx. So now when you think for a second, right now I'm rendering section, which is this section here from ex1, exercise 1. Header and paragraph are coming in. This is header, right? Props.text. This is paragraph, props.text. And this is how we're passing it in. And when you think, what are we going to see if I switch to Chrome? All right, so we see nothing, right? These H1 and P here on the right are literally just empty tags. So they're showing up. The tags are showing up, so that's great, but they're empty, right? And that's because we never passed in that prop. So here for header, I'm gonna say exercise 1 exclamation. Right? And that's going to be called text because if you remember, I mentioned, remember this in the back of your mind, the text property is what we're calling this value right here. And this all gets wrapped up inside of the props object because we can pass in multiple things instead of just one thing. So now if I switch back, what we'll see is exercise 1 does indeed show up inside of our H1 tag, just as we expect, which is pretty wonderful. And we can do the same thing here for a section. For our paragraph, I can just say text equals, and I'll just say I love monkeys, right? And I'll close that off. And if I switch back there, we can see I love monkeys is indeed showing up inside our P tag right there, which is pretty awesome. All right, cool. So that actually works as we'd expect. And the most important takeaway here, honestly, like if this is confusing, I encourage you just to kind of play around with just this set of code, because the most confusing part when you're first learning this is kind of how the relationship works between these like attribute looking things or properties that are passed into the JSX markup here from the parent and how they translate to the props down over here. And I keep hammering on this because like I want you to really understand, like if I change the name text here, what do I need to do in here to actually make it change, right? And just to kind of make this a bit fancier, just so you can see an alternative syntax for this, what you'll see is sometimes people will destructure this. So I can do this in two ways. I can say const, and I can destructure text equals props. just like that. And then I can replace this props.text with just text, just like that. And if I switch back here, we'll see that it still renders properly. But what you can do is you can actually make this kind of inline in the actual argument list as well if you want. So this is pretty much the one way to do it, and the other way to do it that you'll see sometimes people do is they'll just do it directly in here, and they'll say I want to destructure out what I know is going to be passed in this case is going to be text, so I don't have to do props.something all the time, which can get kind of annoying, and you'll see that this actually works the exact same way, and we still get exercise 1 being passed in that way as well. So just be aware that you'll see all these different versions or combinations of these versions depending on kind of who is writing the components. Personally, I like the kind of this version the most. I find it the most clean, and it's pretty easy to kind of add to this list. It just gets a bit confusing as you start having nested elements and things like that. So it really is sometimes I switch it up, but I usually tend to default to this right here, since I do find it kind of nice, kind of concise, neat syntax, and it's pretty obvious what's being passed in once you understand that this needs to directly correspond to this right over here. And if I was to change this name over here, then this would actually break and this would end up becoming undefined over here until we change this here as well, just so that you're aware of that. Okay, cool. Let's take a look at exercise 2 together. Ooh-wee. Okay, so this is not all going to fit on one screen, but I'll try my best here. Hopefully that kind of works. There you go. My face is cutting it off, so not really. I'll just kind of talk through this, and then you can kind of pause the video or check the GitHub link. But for this exercise, what I'd like you to do is create a button.jsx file that has a component that returns a button in it with some text in it. However, the text from the button, inside the button, should come from a prop that's passed into a component, just like we saw with header and paragraph earlier. And I also want you to make the onClick event of the button refer to a function that's passed in as a prop as well. Okay, so this is definitely a bit more advanced than the previous one, because now we're not only passing through just regular like strings or numbers, we're also passing through a function for this button to use. All right. Then what we want to do is create a header.jsx file, same thing as before. It has an h1 in there, and make the text come from a prop that's passed in, same as before, so that doesn't really change very much. And the section in this case that we're going to create, section.jsx file, is going to compose one header with one button component below it and pass the text in it. And as well, the section component is going to, inside of the section component, create a function called handleClick. Okay, and again, I want you to create this in section to be very explicit, not in button. Okay, it's always funny to say button so phonetically accurately. So don't do handleClick in button, do a handleClick in section. And I want this handleClick function just simply to log out boo to the screen, to the console, sorry. So you're gonna wanna make sure you have a console open so you can make sure that that actually works as you'd expect. And I want you to pass this in to the button component in the JSX section of section.jsx so that it can be used as its click handler. And then I want you to kind of do the same thing, replace the app with section in the main.jsx file, and make sure that this all works in the browser. So you should see your h1 in there with a button show up, and then when you click on the button, it should log boot to the console. And then I want you to think as a bonus, why can we pass around this handleClick function as a prop like this? Just try to think of like the theory in JavaScript as to why this is possible. So definitely a bit more going on here. The tricky part here is really getting that click handler to work. And again, really make sure it's being passed in as a prop and you're not defining the handle function inside of button.jsx, just so you can get practice by passing any type of prop through, not only just strings. So give that a shot and then we'll go through it together. All right, so I'm going to create a new folder here. I'll just call this ex2, not 3. And in here, I'm going to create a new file. I'll call this a button.jsx. So I'll just say function button. This is going to take some props. And this is going to return some JSX in this case, it's actually just going to return a button element. So I'm just going to simply just do button because this will be one line. And I'm going to assume that we're going to be passed in like props.text, or we can say button text, for example. I'll just go text for now. And the other thing that we know that we need to be passed in here, if we go back to our exercise, is that it needs to have an onClick event refer to a function that's passed into a prop as well. All right, so we saw in the events video that we can do onClick by doing this. We can say onClick equals something. We can refer to a function here. Now, the tricky thing is, well, we don't have that function defined here. And normally what we would do is something like function handle click in here, right? And then that would kind of like do its thing. But in this case, we can't really, normally we would do this, right? Like that would work. But in this case, we're not being passed in handle click. I said that we want to pass that in from props. So I'm just going to, instead of just say handle click, I'll just say props.handleClick. So I'm going to assume that this function is not defined in the button component itself. It's going to be passed in as a prop, which looks a little bit strange, but we'll kind of get there as we go through this exercise. Let's make sure to export this, and then we'll test this out later. So that is good. Then I want to create a header, header.jsx file. And I'm just going to copy this from our exercise 1 here, just so that it saves some time. So again, in this case, we're going to pass in some text here. I destructured it instead of just using props dot. We just went through all of that, but that one is really no change from the other one. Now, if I go back to exercise 2, let's see. So we have our header here. We have this done. Now we have to focus on our section element. It's going to pass in a header as well as button. So let's just code that from scratch because there's a bit going on there and I don't really want to do too much copying and pasting. So we're going to do section.jsx, and in here, I want to create a function section. I'm going to export default the section here. And I'm going to actually do the imports right away, just so I don't forget. I'm going to import button from /button.jsx. And I want to import, header from header.jsx. All right, so here I want to return some JSX. And the first thing I want in here is header. So for header, I know that I have to pass in some text, right? So let's just get that working at the very least. So I'll just say text equals, and I'll say, and we can actually do this way if you like, just as a hard-coded string, exercise 2. Okay, and I'll just set this up just so that it works correctly. So if I go back to our main.jsx, I'll comment this one out. Oops. I'll comment this one out, and I'll say I want to import section from exercise 2 section.jsx. So we're just kind of going down the things and we're naming it all the same here. If I switch back here, what we'll see is exercise 2 does show up, and we don't have a button yet because we didn't put that in our section yet. All right. Now, oops, that's warm up. So this is what happens when I'm going to close these so I don't get confused. Okay, so we have header showing up. Now let's put in button here, and I'll just save it just like this. Okay, so let's see kind of what happens. You can kind of do it like this, or you can do it all as one tag. But if I do that and I save and I switch back here, notice that you can probably see this here, right? I get this little tiny button, but there's nothing in there. It does render in the actual DOM, so there is a button, but there's no text in it, right? It's just kind of this like little button with no text, so it looks a bit strange, like a little pill. Okay. So how do we get our text in there? I'll just switch this just so that we can actually see it a bit clearer and have more space on the screen. We can pass in text, props.text. So if I just say same thing here, I'll just say text equals, I'll just say click me. So that gets passed in here. Let's see what happens. So I'll switch back here. There we go. So click me. So that's wonderful. So that actually works. So now we have our click me text inside the button, but nothing actually happens when I click on it, right? So if I switch to the console here and I click on this, there's nothing being logged out. All right. Now what we want to do is we want to, if we go back to our exercise 2, we want to, in our section.jsx, we want to create a function called handleClick that logs out boot to the console. We want to pass this into the button component to be used for its click handler prop. So what that means is that our button right here is expecting props.handleClick, and that's going to be a reference to a function that is going to be triggered when the onClick event is triggered. All right, so that was a mouthful. But what that means is that we need to pass in a handleClick here from section, and that's going to be a function. Okay, all right. So in here, in section, I'm going to declare a function. I'm going to call this handleClick. And what this is going to do is going to console.log, and it's going to log out boot to the screen. All right. Now, we know that button is expecting a prop called handleClick to be passed in. So let's pass that in. HandleClick equals. I'm going to put some curly brackets here because we have to make sure that this is the JavaScript reference to handleClick. We can't just pass in a string like this for things like functions. And I'm going to pass in, I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it here, handleClick. Now, there's a lot of confusion probably going through your mind if you're seeing this for the first time. And I was ultra confused seeing this first couple times as well. There's actually quite a lot going on here. So I'm going to show that this works. And then we're going to kind of break it down really quick just to make sure we're all on the same page before going to the next exercise. So I'm going to switch back here and click on click me. And there we go. We get boo being logged to the screen as many times as we click that button. So that actually works now, which is quite fantastic. All right. Now, what is happening here? Well, we're passing a reference to the function handleClick as a prop called handleClick to the button component, which it's going to use in its button's onClick event handler to call when a click event happens. Okay. Now, there's a few things that usually go wrong most commonly when people do this. One is you'll call this function here, right? So if I call this function here and I switch back here, what we'll see, if I just reload the screen, what we'll see is boo is logged immediately, right? That seems a bit confusing because I never clicked the button. So the reason that is that this is going to execute handleClick, and then they're going to evaluate the result, and it's going to pass that to handleClick. So we're actually going to get undefined as our handleClick. And just to show you, I'll console.log the props here. Okay, just so we can see that. I'll reload the page, and we'll see that I'll open this one here. We have handleClick is undefined. That is not what we want, right? So if I click this, nothing is going to happen, right? So that is because what's happening here is if you call the function, this function, if you think about it, is actually doing this. It's returning undefined. I never put a return. The default return in JavaScript is undefined, right? So we don't want to call it. We want to pass a handle to that function. No pun intended. And the job of the onClick handler is to call it. So it's going to put the parentheses when it gets called at call time. Later on, only when a click happens. So be aware of that, okay? The other confusing thing here is the naming, right? I named the prop name the same thing as the actual function name. Now, I can do this in another way if it's less confusing to you. I can put boo, right, as my function name. And I can pass in boo, for example, right here, if I want to, right? And if I reload this page, we'll see that works the same. Okay, so just be aware that there's a lot of things that can change here that can make this either easier to understand or harder to understand depending on kind of what your mental model is. And sometimes you'll see mixes of these approaches and kind of they all work and it's kind of sometimes a matter of opinion which is better than the other. Now, what I would probably do here is this is a bit messy. Again, I really don't like having props on everything in here. I would probably rename this to or destructure this directly in here to take the handleClick as well as the text just like this. And now you can see why this is an object because we can have multiple arguments being passed in and we can destructure it all at once like this. And I can get rid of the props here. Get rid of the props here and clean that up. And then no longer do we have our props over here to log out because that's going to be undefined. we will have this work the same way. So now if I reload the page, what we'll see is this boo still works as expected. Okay. Now that was a lot, and I encourage you to kind of go through that again and play around with the naming and the passing of things around before you go to the next exercise to make sure you understand exactly what's happening. Now I want to answer this before moving to exercise 3 really quickly. Why can we do this? Why can we pass around handle click as a prop like this? Why is this something that is allowed, right? Handle click equals boo, just like this, right? Or handle click like it was previously. Well, in JavaScript, functions are what are called like first class like data. Everything is first class. Everything technically is like some form of object for the most part, one way or another. We can actually pass around anything that we want to functions and to other data structures and things like that. We can pass around strings, numbers, we can pass around null, undefined, objects, arrays. We can pass around even functions, because functions really are just fancy objects behind the scenes that JavaScript knows how to actually call and use in specific ways. Okay, so we can actually pass a function just like we would pass a string or any other value in JavaScript, just like this, down to the child, in this case, down to the button component to use itself, and it can be responsible to actually call that function later on when it actually needs. All right, cool. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's take a look at exercise 3 together. Whew, we're going a long way here. What a journey. So for this one, what I'd like you to do is create a button .jsx file. It has a component, returns a button with some text in it, and same thing as before. Okay, I want you to basically copy what you had in the previous exercise, where you're passing in the event handler as well as the text for the actual button. Okay, you're always thinking, why are we copying things then? Or this is like, I want something different, but this is quite a complex exercise. So bear with me while I explain this. Okay, so mostly the same. If you did the previous exercise, a button component, it's going to take props, and those props are going to define what show in the actual button itself as text, as well as the on-click event handler for the button is going to come from the props as well. Then what I want you to do is create a card.jsx file, and that's going to have a component in it that returns an h2 tag with some text in it, as well as the button element that you just created previously below it. Now, I want you to make the text inside of this h2 component here. Sorry, in this h2 component in this card.jsx file come from a prop, which is passed into the component. Okay, so again, card is really just a component that has an h2 with this button below it, and it's going to have its props coming from a parent component. It's actually not even going to have the stuff needed for the button in it. We'll see shortly that that's going to come from somewhere else. So really all this is doing is rendering the button as well as this h2. And this is going to be a bit strange because we're not going to have everything we need right away to make this work, but bear with me as we go through the last step here. Now, finally, I want you to create a profile.jsx file that returns an h1 inside of it, and then it's going to have a card component below it. And I want you to, one more step here. I want you to have the text inside of the h1 come from the props as well as all the props needed for the card. So this is where things get really confusing, and this is where I have to apologize that this was very challenging for me to write, and I hope that you can kind of make sense of these instructions. Effectively, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a components tree. This is just a kind of like one strand down, where we have button, and then we have card, and then we have profile, and then we're going to have our profile being used inside of the main JSX file. And I want you to not hard code anything for this h1 or for the card. I want you to have everything from for the profile come from the prop. So it's going to have to be passed in from the actual parent component in this case. Okay. Now I want you to replace the app component in the main.jsx file with the profile. I'm going to create a function that logs out the text it worked, pass in all the props needed to make all the text show up properly in profile, card, as well as button, as well as a function for the button's handle click to work. Now, this is really, really confusing. If you're reading this and you're just like totally confused, I understand, right? But you probably are just going to want to watch this and kind of go through it with me, and hopefully it makes sense. But this is an example of prop drilling, right? We're going to drill the props from our main.jsx file all the way through profile. Then it's going to go through profile through to card. Then it's going to go through card through to button. And all of these props are going to be defined inside of the main.jsx file, where we're going to be passing it in as props to the initial profile component. So we are drilling these props pretty far through this component tree. In this case, it's again only one strand all the way down. But what we're really going to end up with is something that looks like this. We're going to have kind of our main file. It's going to have our profile in it, and then that's going to have our card in it, and then that's going to have our button in it. And each of these has some other things in there. So profile has our H1, for example, in there. And then our card also has our H2 in there, which has its own text. And then our button has some text as well. But the props for this are going to come from main. The props for card are going to also come from main. And the props from button are going to come from main. But they need to be passed through profile, and then passed through card, and then passed through to button, depending on where we are in the tree. Okay, so hopefully that kind of makes sense. If that's still confusing to you, definitely watch as we build this out together. But if you kind of get the gist of that, give it a shot and drill those props through from main, and then we'll actually work this out together. Okay, so I'm going to create a exercise 3 folder here. And in exercise 3, I'm going to go ahead and start creating these. So I'm going to create a button.jsx. To save some time here, I'll just copy this button over here. Okay, I'll just get rid of these just so it's really less confusing. We have our handle click being passed in as a prop. We have our text being passed in as a prop, and the button is going to render the text here inside the button, which is being passed in as a prop, and the on click is going to refer to the handle click button that's going to be passed in, a handle click function, sorry, that's going to be passed in as a prop from the parent. So none of this is by default in here. This is all being passed in from a parent component. Okay. So then we want to create a card.jsx file that has a H2 as well as a button below it. So then what I'll do is I'll create a card.jsx file in here. I'll just say function card. We're going to have some props in here in a second, and I'm going to return some JSX. In the JSX, I'm going to say an H2, and we're going to put something in here. And we also need our button below this. So I'm going to say import button from /button.jsx. And make sure you're careful with your imports here. If you accidentally import it from another folder, that might lead to a lot of confusion. So just make sure your imports are correct there as well. Okay, and here I'm just going to put my button just like that. All right, so to start, what's going to be a bit confusing, I'm going to export this while I talk, is that we don't actually have those props yet. But I'm going to just assume that they come in. Okay. Now, the confusing thing is, what are we going to name these? Well, I know that, for example, I can name them technically whatever I want, and then I can pass it down to the button. So what I'll do is I'll be explicit here. I'll say H2, no, I'll say card text. Or maybe I'll say text. So this is where it gets a bit confusing. And I'll say button text, and then I'll say handle click, because we only have one click function here. So in here, I'll put the text. Again, this is coming from a parent, which we haven't defined yet. And I'll say, so button expects handle click and text. So this is, again, where the naming gets really confusing. So handle click is going to be a handle click, but we have to be careful. Text here is going to be button text. Okay, that's why I was kind of a bit wary of what we'll call this. Maybe I'll just call this card text. just to be really explicit. Okay, there we go. All right, and I'll rename it here. So we have card text, button text, handle click. Now the name here, we have to be really careful of, right? Watch here, I named it text because that's what button expects is text, right? But the value is coming from button text, which is coming from right here, which is the actual props. And this is where things start to get gnarly pretty quickly if you're not comfortable with the previous examples of how props get passed around and how we can rename these properties kind of on the fly like this. Okay, so looking good so far. Let's go to profile.jsx. It's going to return h1 with a card below it, and it's going to have everything come from props as well. So similar to our card. So I'll create a new file here. I'll call this profile.jsx. I'll say function profile, and I'll just put in the props here shortly. I'm going to return some JSX, and I'll export default profile. And I'm going to import the card from card.jsx because that's really all I need, because card itself knows how to import the button. And this is going to have some h1 in here, and then we're going to have our card tag right below that. Now, let's think about this one. So we know that we want some profile. Let's just call this profile text. Let's not get confused there. So I'm going to put that in here. And if you're thinking, Nader, where are you getting these names from? Well, I'm just making these up, right? I can call the function arguments whatever I want. I have to be careful in the next step when I create the parent component that I'm passing in the expected thing to the function below it. So if we look at card, we'll see an example of that. Card expects several things. It expects three things: card text, button text, handle click. Let's just pass those in really quick. And what you'll normally see people do is something like this: is card text equals something, button text equals something, and then handle click equals something. Okay, so we're going to pass in these three things. So we know that we need that, and that's going to come from the parent. So I'm going to put card text, I'm going to put button text, and I'm going to put handle click. Okay, now you can hopefully see why I didn't just name it text here, because it would get kind of confusing pretty quickly. Card text, this is button text, and then this is handle click. Now it could be named text, and that would be fine. We just have to be careful with name clashes and things like that, because eventually we're going to need to pass in multiple things here. Okay. Now, if you're looking at this and being like, oh my gosh, this is so convoluted. What is happening here? Why would you do this? Why wouldn't you just define the function here and then the text over here and then text over here, etc., etc.? Well, you sometimes would, but a lot of times you don't, because you need access to those in a higher component, and you have to kind of use it the same way in both of them. And this is quite common. So knowing how to drill these props down, in this case is a bit of a convoluted example, but is so important because just getting these names right and knowing that you can pass something through like this and thread it through this component tree is so important. And we'll go through this right at the end of this exercise just to make sure we're on the same page. Okay, so now home stretch. Inside of our main.jsx, what we need to do is import our section. In this case, it's not sections, from our profile here. So we renamed it profile. And I'm going to do profile. Oops, I'll do profile here. All right. And did I not? Yeah, profile. There we go. Profile exercise 3 main.jsx. All right. So now, this is a little bit odd because this is not really a component that we have over here. So I wouldn't normally recommend you to do this, but I just want to show you that it is technically possible to really, these are just regular JavaScript, these are just functions that we're defining. If you were to use hooks later that we're getting into, you would want to make sure that all this stuff is actually in a component, because as you can see right here, we don't actually have a component anymore. This is kind of the top of the tree, the very root of the tree, and it kind of ends here with this React strict mode. So we're just going to define our data out here, and it's going to be fine. It's not going to be a big deal, but we can, normally you would make a component and pass these through. So yeah, let's do that. I'm going to call a function. I'll call this, say boo. And this is simply going to console.log boo from main.jsx. All right. Now, let's take a look at profile, because this is where things get really, really ultra fancy. So profile needs, where's our profile? Profile needs 4 things. Okay, it needs profile text, card text, button text, handle click. Okay, so let's make sure we pass all those in. Profile text, something. Card text, something. Button text, something. And then handle click, something. All right, so that's the structure we're going to use. We're going to pass all of these in from our root node in this case. So very high up in the tree. It's several kind of layers removed from our button down at the very bottom. And we're going to see if this works. So our profile text, for now, I'll just say profile. Card text, I'll just say card, just so that this is nice and simple. Button text, I'll just say click me. And handle click, well, this is our say boo function. I could do this in line 2, but I'm going to pass a reference to this function up here that I defined earlier. Okay, and be careful not to actually call the function, because that's the job of the actual on-click handler in this case on that actual button component. So that was a lot, right? This is kind of crazy if you think about it. There's just like so much ridiculousness with this example, because we didn't define anything as we were building up these components, right? Notice that there's no functions, there's no data anywhere in here. We don't even know what is going to come through here. None of these know what's actually happening and what the text or the even the event handler is going to be. We defined that all here, and we passed it through to be used and threaded it through every single component. So let's see if this works. I'm going to switch back to React over here, or my actual browser. I'm going to click on this, and there we go. Boo from main.jsx. We have our profile coming through. We have our card coming through. And if I switch to my elements tab as well, we'll see there we go, to H1 from our card, or from profile, H2 from our card, and then our button right below that. And those are all rendering below each other because they were being returned either directly or as within fragments. So that is pretty awesome. So we need to kind of like look at this and appreciate what's really happening here. So let's go through this really quick before we look at the bonus exercise together. I'll start kind of bottom up. Okay, and hopefully that makes sense. Maybe we'll just go top down really quick right after that. I know this is a long video, but this is a really important set of topics to really get practice with. So button is a component. It expects 2 props, handle click and text. Okay, it is going to render the text in between the button tag, and it's going to call the handle click function that's being passed in whenever the button is clicked. Right? We don't know what these are at this moment. We just know that they're going to be passed to us as props later on. Okay, so where are we using this button? It can be used in multiple places. Right now, we're only using it in one place. We're using it in card. So let's look at that. So you can see that we're using it because we imported it over here, and we're using it down here. Now, what is card? Well, card expects three different props: card text, button text, and handle click. Okay, so what does it do with those? Well, it's going to render out card text in an H2 tag, and it's going to take the button text and the handle click and pass it to button, right, to use, which we know it needs because we just saw that, right? We expect that to be passed in by whoever is using button. In this case, card is using button. We expect these to be passed in, and they are being passed in. Do we know what they are yet? No. We just can assume that they're going to be passed in correctly later on. Okay, so that's card. And profile is very similar to this. Profile is going to use card, and inside of profile, we have 4 different props: profile text, card text, button text, handle click. And profile is going to return an H1 with profile text in it. Then it's going to render the card. We know that card needs 3 props, just like we knew button needs 2 props. Do we need to know what button needs? No, because card is handling that already, right? As long as we pass card all the things it needs, we can assume that it is going to pass everything that it needs to its children as well. So what does card need? These 3 things. It needs card text, button text, handle click. So that's what we're passing in: card text, button text, handle click. Okay, do we know again what any of these things are at the moment that this component is defined? No, these are all going to be dynamically passed in wherever profile is being used by the parent component. So this is how we can give an input to a function and get a different output every single time. I can make a different profile text or a different card text or a different button text or a different function anytime I want and use it in different places, and it will work just as expected in a slightly different way with either different text or different button behavior, which is pretty awesome. Now, finally, what we did is we put this all together inside our main.jsx file. We pulled in profile. We defined a function because we know that we need a handle click function deep down in this tree somewhere. And we passed into profile all the things that it needs. We just saw that profile needs 4 things: profile text, card text, button text, handle click. Okay, I'm repeating this on purpose so that you get sick of my voice. And here we're passing all those in. We know that these are strings, the first 3, profile text, card text, button text. And we know that handle click is a reference to a function that we need to call whenever that button gets clicked. And that is right here. Okay, now this is a bit weird because it's not a component, but doesn't really matter. It's still going to work just fine. We could also do inline if this troubles you that we're defining this kind of like outside of the React scope per se. So, what is happening is that if we follow this handle click, for example, because that's probably the most complicated one, this is a reference to a function. We're passing it into profile as handle click. Profile is going to get it right here, handle click. What's it going to do? It's just going to pass it down to card. What's card going to refer to it as? Well, it's also going to refer to it as handle click. Could it refer to it as something different? Yes, that would be fine. In this case, we use the same name. So let's take a look at card. Card's going to grab handle click as a prop, which we just saw was passed in. It's going to pass that value to button as a prop for its handle click property as well. And if we go into button in here, we see that indeed it's grabbing handle click. And what is it doing with it here? Now it is finally actually being used as intended, where it's being used as the click handler for the on click event for this button, right? None of the card, nor the profile, nor main.jsx actually used that click handler. It was all being passed through and threaded through down to button to use. Okay, and the same thing happens for the various different texts throughout this tree as well. I would highly encourage you to actually draw this out like on paper if you can, and actually like trace down what the different props are being used and the names and the values of those props as they're being passed in. So for example, in this case, handle click is being passed the value of the handle click, which is in this case boo, right? The boo function definition that we saw earlier in the main in this file. Right? Profile text is going to be the profile string, card text is going to be the card string, etc., etc. And if you draw the keys and values for this as they're being passed through the functions, what you'll see is a really neat kind of flow of this data down through this function tree, down profile, card, and then finally at button. Now you can imagine this is like 3 layers deep or 4 layers deep or what have you. Sometimes you can go a bit deeper than this. Now this gets very confusing very quickly. There are lots of solutions to this problem, and we'll see those in later React videos. And once we start looking at things like states and state management, this kind of compounds the challenges that you'll run into when you're working with data like this. And we'll see some solutions to those as well in those later videos as well. Okay, so if you got through that, good job. Give yourself a pat on the back. Honestly, this is probably one of the more confusing topics, but it is so important to understand because you will see it 100% in pretty much every single React project, including ones that you work on by yourself. So that said, let's go to the bonus exercise and wrap up this video together. Now, this one is a bit different. I would like you in this one to create a paragraph JSX file that has a component that returns a p tag with some text in it that comes from props. Okay, so this one looks like it's shorter. You're like, oh, this is a bonus. This must be simple, but there's a bit of a trickery in here as well. Inside the main.jsx file, I want you to replace the app with your paragraph, but this time I want you to build out your paragraph like this. Up until now, what we've been seeing is kind of the self-closing tags for our components. But what you can actually do is treat them very similar to regular HTML components and actually put children inside of them. So that sounds really weird. That's a very misconstrued sentence, but that's, I guess, what you get when you're working with the DOM. So in this case, we could put an H1 inside the paragraph. So paragraph is the parent and then H1 is the child. Okay, now this is valid, right? HTML, if you think about it, this is like literally how HTML works, and we expect to see code like this pretty much everywhere in our HTML files, right? But if you think about this in the context of React, we haven't really seen this yet, where we have like a custom component and then there's like a child in there. It's a bit different, right? Strange. Now, what I want you to do is try to figure out how are you going to get this h1 that's being passed in as a child here to this paragraph. How are you going to get it to show up inside of the paragraph component? Okay, and as a hint for this, I have at the very bottom here, I want you to think of what the props are. And specifically, if you start logging out the props, maybe you'll get a hint as to how this might work. So give that a shot and see how far you can get with it, and then we'll go through this together to wrap up the video. Okay, so I'm just going to create a new folder here. I'll just call this bonus. And in here, I'll create a new file. I'll call this paragraph.jsx. So I'm going to say function paragraph. And I know this is going to take some props. I'll just call it props for now. I know that I like to destructure things, but I'll just do that. So in here, I'm going to do export default paragraph. And in here, I know that, let's just say I'm going to call this text. So I'm going to say props.text for the paragraph. Okay. Now, I know that I want to have an h1 in there later, but we'll just stick with that for now. So what I want to do now is I'm going to go to main.jsx, and I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to say import paragraph from bonus slash paragraph.jsx, right? Make sure it's from our bonus folder if you're following my structure as well. Now, what I want to do here is I'll just comment that out just so that we can see that's still there. So none of this is actually going to show. I want to have it so that I can do this. I can say paragraph. And in this case, I'm going to put an h1 in there. And I'm going to say h1 from main.jsx. I actually realized that I forgot to technically put in the bonus here. Technically, when I said this, like we're supposed to pass in a prop here. So I didn't really specify that, but hopefully you can kind of see that we do need a prop being passed in here as well. Okay, so let's go back to our paragraph here, and I'm going to do a console log of our props just so we can see what that actually is. And I'm going to, oops, I always forget the return here, return the p tag. So we actually get some JSX returned from there. Now, if I go back to my main, let's take a look at how this works. So we have paragraph and we're closing tag here. We're not passing in props to paragraph yet, so we should probably fix that because I don't think we'll actually see anything in there. And this is kind of confusing. I don't really know what that is, how we're getting access to that. But let's just kind of like go to our browser, we'll log this out, see what the props end up being, and see if we can figure some stuff out. Okay, so I'm going to switch to my browser. I have a blank page here. Open up this div. We can see that we have a blank p tag in there, so that's good. So at least the p tag is rendering, right? So this paragraph tag here is actually rendering, but there's no text in it, which makes sense because we're not passing in text as a prop yet. So that's fine. So that's all good. Let's go to console, and let me just reload the page here. And what we'll see is that, so props is an object. So we are getting props, which is interesting. It's not empty. So that's curious. I'll open that up. It looks like there is a children property in there. So that's kind of interesting. I never passed in children. So I don't know where that's coming from. Right? Like if you think about it, I never passed that in as a prop to paragraph, right? If I go back to, where am I going here? I never did like children equals, so-and-so, right? I never did this. So that's kind of curious that we're getting this children prop being passed in. So let me open this. A lot of this stuff is cut off here at the bottom, but we won't really need that part. But the most interesting thing here is that if I actually kind of open this up, what we'll see is that this is actually a React element. right? And we can see that because this is a symbol React element. The type of this thing is like, it has all the structure of like the React create element call. If we pass this object to React create element, it would actually create what looks to be an h1 tag. And then it would have children itself of this text node right here. So, that's kind of interesting. And this is called children. So, okay, so that's cool. I'm not really sure what to do with that. So let's get the text working for now. Let's make sure that actually works. So I'll say text equals, I'll just say, hello monkey. And I'm going to pass that in as a prop to paragraph. And we know that paragraph needs a text, right? So it needs text here. So if I switch that, we can see hello monkey. So it actually shows up here in our browser, which is great. And if I open up here, props again, we can see, okay, well, interesting. So text hello monkey is showing up, which is what we expect. And props has children in it. And that is kind of just that React element, I guess, right? This is kind of odd. So what do we do with that? Well, let's see what we can do. I'm actually going to kind of do this here. So I'm going to return, and I'm going to up here surround this. This is very confusing to refactor all this. Gonna do this, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get children being passed in as a prop. So I'm gonna put that here as props.children. And I'm gonna evaluate that object and just kind of put it directly in here into this markup and see what happens. Okay, and I'm also going to render my p tag just as we'd expect, and then that should render as we expect because we already saw that working. Okay, so keep in mind, I'm not really passing in children, right? I'm not passing it in over here directly. I'm only passing in text, but it seems like React is doing some stuff behind the scenes for me, and it's somehow giving me this as another prop called children, and maybe we can use it. I don't really know what this is going to do, but let's see. Let's go back here, and whoa, right? Take a look at that. So I actually have that h1 showing up as an h1. So if I go to elements and look at that, I got my h1 right beside my p tag. So what is happening here is that we are actually given a prop by React of all of the children of the parent component as, and it's called children by default. And we can actually just pass that to JSX to render as a React component. So to make that really explicit, what's happening here is, if you think about it, what React is really doing behind the scenes here is doing this. It's doing, like, literally doing this, right? And it's like automatically taking this and putting it as a new prop called children. That's like literally what it's doing, right? And we can take, we know if this is a JSX element, right? If you think about it, we can take that and we can just basically shove it in here as a JSX element, because that's what it is, copy and paste it, just like this, and it should show up. And that's what's happening, right? So we are being passed this kind of implicitly instead of explicitly by the React compiler in this case, and it's going to give us a new prop alongside our text prop with children if we ever have stuff inside of these brackets, in between the parent brackets like this. And that can be as many things as we want. So in here, I can put, like, for example, I can put like an input tag if I really want to, and I can put like a placeholder in there of like, you know, name or something like that, and I can do that, and that will also show up as because that's part of the children, right? Because we are telling it render all of the children, if I go back to paragraph, above the p tag inside of this paragraph component, right? And if I put this below, that's going to have the p tag up at the top, and then all the children are going to render after. If I switch over here, what we'll see is the p tag is up top, and then all the children are going to render after. Now, and I'll just show you what this looks like in the actual object here for props as well. You can see children now is an array of 2 React elements, right? 1 and 2, or 0 and 1 in this case. Each of these is a React element, the first one being the H1, the second one being the input. We can have as many of these as we want. And as long as we have, anything in between these brackets here, for a React element, that automatically gets passed to us as a children prop, and we can use it inside of that component. So just to clean this up a little bit, what we'll see is I'll just say children here, and I'll say text, and I'll just get rid of these props over here and clean that up just so that it's much easier to actually see. And if I reload this page, children is not defined because I spelled it wrong. Children, there we go. Now we'll see everything works just as expected. And what you'll see is this is used quite a lot in the case where you want to be able to pass children in to the actual element at the parent level, but then still have them being passed down to the child nodes as well. So that is pretty awesome. Hopefully this set of exercises made sense to you. I know that there was quite a lot in this video, and it's quite a long video, but honestly, this is probably one of the more important concepts to understand, because we're going to be using props literally everywhere, all the time, in almost every single component going forward. And you really want to be comfortable with this idea that props is literally just a set of properties on an object that is passed automatically to every single React component, and they have various names. Some of them are created for us, like children in this case, but most of them we define ourselves, and we can grab them and use them inside of that component. We can even pass them further down to other children components and prop drill them down throughout our React tree and use them wherever they need to be used, or multiple sibling components. So hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear in the comments how these exercises went for you, or if you have any feedback on them or any difficulties. And what we're gonna do in the next video together is start to get into hooks for the first time, which I'm really excited about. We're gonna go through the first all-important hook, which is the use state hook, where we can actually take data in our app and actually start manipulating it and have it show on the screen, so we can actually work with and manipulate content on the screen for the first time dynamically and make our app reactive, which is the entire point of React in the first place. I can't wait to get to that video. I'll see you in that one. See you later.